Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll make a start now. We're already a little bit late. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Development Policy Centre and the Crawford School, and also let me acknowledge the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. My name's Stephen Howes and I'm the Director of the Development Policy Centre. We have a whole week of events this week. It's a very exciting week for us, and we have one more tomorrow. So I'll just mention that. David Booth from the Overseas Development Institute, talking about business, politics and the state in Africa, challenging the orthodoxies. That's at 12:30. And we have more events coming up next week. In fact, we've got a Disability and Development Forum next Thursday. But today, of course, we're here to hear Francois Bourguignon, but I'm very happy to say that I won't be chairing because I've done a few, and I'm very grateful to Professor Hal Hill, who has the armchair in economics, one of our very distinguished economics leaders, I could say, here at the ANU. He's going to chair today's event. So Hal, thank you, and over to you.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is a very new seminar room, the first time I've been in here, so hopefully it'll work all right. This is a big week for the Development Policy Centre, as Stephen mentioned, a galaxy of stars visiting us, and all power to the centre, and Stephen and the team, because it's a new centre, but it's already making a real impact in both policy and intellectual circles, and sometimes the two coincide, and that's the point of the centre, isn't it, to make them coincide a bit more. It's a great honour to have a very distinguished speaker here from Paris, Professor Francois Bourguignon. He's a major figure in development economics. Anyone who's worked in development economics will know his name, and in particular, if you work on inequality, you'll certainly know his name. He's one of the leaders in the field. He's written seminal books and papers on this subject, and it's hard to think of a more topical subject, globalisation and inequality. In all the countries we work in, we worry about it. In Australia also we worry about it, Professor Bourguignon. In fact, one of our esteemed colleagues, former ANU professor, now our Member of Parliament, Andrew Lee's written on it in Australia as well. So it's a very big issue, and we're very lucky to have Professor Bourguignon to speak on it. Professor Bourguignon is the former Chief Economist at the World Bank. In fact, we're having another of your former Chief Economists at the World Bank here in 2 weeks' time, Professor Justin Lin, giving a lecture. Professor Bourguignon is Director of the Paris School of Economics and many other things. It's his first visit to both Australia and to the ANU, I believe, so you're very welcome, Professor Bourguignon. Thank you for coming a long way from Paris, and may I now invite you to speak on globalisation and inequality. I might mention, by the way, Professor Bourguignon has a book already out in French and translated into Italian and German and about to be translated into English, called Globalisation of Inequality. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind word. It is a real pleasure to be here. I heard and I read very often about ANU, so it's quite nice to see directly what it looks like. And I must say that I'm extremely impressed by this room. Okay, because we don't have very much time, I will jump into the presentation and say a few words of introduction for the topic. First, you can see that the title is not really globalization and inequality, it is globalization of inequality. And what I want to mean with this title is really two things. On the one hand, the fact that inequality is tending to become a global issue. And it is true that because I've been working in the World Bank for quite some time, we tend to look at inequality at the global level over there. But it is true that there is some movement toward considering inequality at the global level and making sure that poor countries will catch up with less poor countries, and the emerging countries will be catching up with rich countries, etc. And this is a concern. The Millennium Development Goals, the Millennium Declaration back in 2000, the fact that we are thinking about what will be the post-2015 agenda shows that this is really an important issue. And the second meaning of the globalization of inequality is the fact that we observe today in many countries in the world that inequality is increasing. We just mentioned that this was the case in Australia, but it is the case practically in 80% of the developed countries, and it is the case in many developing countries or emerging countries too. And then the issue is to know whether, when you see this kind of common evolution, whether there is a common cause behind that. And of course, the immediate, the first culprit that we could think about, it would be globalization. Is globalization responsible for that? So this is the general goal of that work, which is to analyze this globalization, the relationship between globalization and inequality. Two quick quotes to introduce that. The first quote is from a French political philosopher, Raymond Aron, which in a book in the early 60s, a book called The Dawn of Global History, wrote this: in the human society, in the process of unification, inequality between nations acquires the same meaning as inequality among classes in the past. Standards of living differ today between continents or between countries more than they ever did. At the same time, the perception of inequality increases, whereas resignation to poverty and to destiny is disappearing. And I think this is right way of looking at many of the things that I will be talking about. But the reason why I am using this quote is because I want to oppose this Aron with another Aron, with Henry Aron, who a long time ago, again it was in the 50s or in the 60s, he was a researcher in the Brookings Institution in Washington, and one day he said, you people working on income inequality, what are you doing? There is nothing going on in this area. Studying income inequality is like watching grass grow. Now, if this is the case, then grass is growing much, much faster these days. Okay, the fact and the questions I want to ask are the following. But I'm not sure that I will have time to go over all these. This is a presentation which is slightly longer than the 30, 40 minutes I've been given. So let me simply give a sketch of what the book is about and the kind of issues I'm looking at in the book, and maybe I will focus on some of them. The basic fact I'm starting from is this double reversal in history. The first reversal is the fact that global inequality is declining after practically 2 centuries of continuous increase in inequality. So we have this first reversal, and in terms of social justice, in terms of moral philosophy, we might be very satisfied to see that this trend toward more and more inequality in the world, at the end, is being reversed. And the second reversal is the fact that in many countries we observed a lot of stability in the income distribution or in the distribution of the standards of living during several decades, let's say after the Second World War. And today we observe that this stability has broken down, and there is a reversal in the trend. Now inequality is increasing. So these are the facts, and I would like to document those facts. And then the next step is, of course, to understand what is behind that. So I will have the question, is the present wave of globalization the common cause to those reversals? And the answer will be partly yes, but not only globalization. And the question we may ask is whether this rise in inequality within nations would not be a threat with respect to the economic gains that one can get from globalization. Globalization, because it is a reallocation of economic activity in the world in a more efficient way, there is a global gain to be obtained. There is a distribution of that gain among countries, and there is also a distribution of that gain within countries. If the distribution of that gain within country is very unequal, then it may be the case that in some countries, in some societies, there will be forces rising to go against this process of globalization. And we're already, in many countries, observing that. In many countries, we have political parties which are campaigning against opening up, against what is going on with the globalization process and with the progressive opening up of economies in all dimensions. So from that point of view, there may be a risk if the inequality is going too far, that there will be a break on this process of moving toward a more equal world, simply because there will be too much inequality within nations. And then, of course, the last question is, if we want to prevent inequality to increase within nations, despite the globalization process, what are the instruments that we have in our hands? Okay, let me first go through the evidence that I'm putting forward here. So let's, because I'm not getting very much time, let's move directly to the evidence that we have here. On this chart, I'm taken some previous work I've done with a colleague of mine, Christian Morisson, who is an economic historian, where we used Angus Madison's well-known GDP per capita series, and we combined that with proxies, with approximations that Morisson put together on the income distribution in several big countries in the world, or in several groups of countries in the world during this historical period, starting in the early 19th century. And we came up with this estimate of the evolution of inequality in the world. So the top curve is the Gini coefficient. So going from 0.5 in the early 19th century to 0.65 in the more or less the end of the 20th century. And needless to say, 0.65 is a very, very, very high level of inequality. The countries which are the most unequal in the world, South Africa probably today, Brazil a couple of years ago, had a Gini coefficient which was 0.60. And when you try to go beyond 0.60, you really have to get a lot of unequalizing changes taking place in order to reach this 0.65. So there is nothing surprising to see that inequality in the world is much more pronounced than inequality in the most inegalitarian countries. And the curve at the bottom is simply another indicator. It is simply the ratio of the mean income of the top 20% of the world population over the bottom 20%. I must insist on the fact that this inequality is among world citizens. In other words, when you look at the top 20% of the world, we have Americans and Australians, as well as some Chinese or some Brazilians, certainly. So this is not only between countries, it is also within countries, combining the two. But one thing is completely clear, that the reason why we had this increase in inequality is, before all, due to the increase in the inequality between countries. And in the early 19th century, this is the Industrial Revolution and the takeoff of in Britain, and then the takeoff of some countries in continental Europe, and then we have the evolution that we know. Now, if we now try to look at what has been happening in the recent past, this is what we have. Now we have the recent period. Data are not completely comparable because the number of countries is not the same, the statistical information is not the same, and then there is a big change taking place, which is that Madison figures are based on purchasing power parities, which are based on 1990, and now we are using purchasing power parities based on 2005, and there is a big difference between the two. In particular, we discovered that Chinese were much poorer than what we thought 10 years ago, simply because we didn't observe well the price system in China. So there is a discontinuity, but this is not really what matters. What matters is the fact that the curve is now declining. and declining big time, because if you look at the Gini coefficient, the curve at the top, in 20 years, you have a decline in Gini coefficient of more than 5 percentage points. And if you look at the evolution, historical evolution, you see that 5 percentage point is more or less the increase in global inequality over the whole 20th century. So in 20 years, we raised 1 century of increase in global inequality. So this is something really very big and certainly an historical event. Okay, so let's now look at the evidence about within-country inequality. This chart is maybe a little old because it goes from the mid-80s to the mid-2000s. Now we would be able to get data until the end of the 2000s, and the picture would be slightly different. In particular, many countries which are at the bottom, where the inequality has decreased over this period. If we were to look at them today, and especially Australia, we would find that inequality has increased. In the case of Australia, the increase in inequality is really over the last 7 or 8 years. Okay, so things will be slightly modified. And if you look at the case of France, which is also a country where we had a decrease in inequality between the mid-80s and the mid-2000s, if we were to look at the late 2000s, we will also have an increase in inequality. So what is important here is that when you look at the OECD countries, we have this massive increase in inequality. And we, of course, in this group, we have the usual suspects. We have United States, we have the United Kingdom, but we have countries which are more surprising. We have Sweden, we have Germany, we have Finland. Countries, Nordic countries, where you have this very strong egalitarian view of the world. There are also countries where inequality has increased and has increased substantially. Another type of evidence is coming from this database called Top Incomes, which has been launched by a work by Tony Atkinson and Thomas Piketty in the Paris School of Economics, and which is based on tax returns since the beginning of the 20th century. They're able to look at the evolution of inequality of market income, that is before taxes and transfers, over a very long period of time. And then you have the same phenomenon, a reversal. You have this U-curve for all those countries in this picture. And you see that there is this big drop in inequality corresponding to the crisis before the Second World War, the Second World War itself, and then we have a stabilization of inequality, and then early in 1980 we see those curves going up again. And we have again here countries which are very different. We have the US, which is a top curve, and in the US you see that today the level of inequality is back to where it was 1 century ago, exactly. The UK, it's not yet the case, but we also have countries like Japan. We have France, and you can see that in the case of France, the evolution is less pronounced than in other countries. And at the bottom, you have Sweden, where, again, you see a very clear increase in the share of the top 5%. Another indicator of the evolution of inequality is at the macro level. This is the evolution of the labor share in GDP. We know that capital income is more unequally distributed than labor income. And what we observe here that, again, in all these countries, this is more or less the G7 countries, there is a drop, very regular, very secular drop in the share of labor. And if I had put Australia here, Australia is also a country where, over the same period of time, you have a drop in the share of labor by more than 5 percentage points. So again, this is an evolution which is completely general, and this is consistent with the view that inequality is increasing when we look at it in micro terms. This is a situation in developing countries. This is taken from the database in the World Bank called POVCAL. Not all countries are there. And we see here that we are not exactly in the same situation as in developed countries. It is not the case that we have a majority, a huge majority of countries where inequality is increasing, but we have many of them where it is increasing. And in particular, we find China, we find the fast growers are more or less all there. China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, all those countries are countries where inequality has very substantially increased over the last 20 or 25 years. And in some cases, the increase is really big. In China, for example, for the urban sector, which is right at the top, you have an increase in Gini coefficient by 8 percentage points. This is something which is really very big. But we also have countries where inequality is decreasing, and I'm not showing that here for to be saving on time, but if you look at Latin America, for example, there is an interesting phenomenon, which is the fact that inequality increased very much during the 80s and the 90s, and during the 2000s, inequality is going down. So you have a kind of inverted view of inequality in Latin America, but when you look at, let's say, the early 80s and today, you have something which is either flat or which has increased. So it is difficult to say that inequality has very much improved in the case of Latin America. So this is what we can say about the facts. And again, to come back to the quote by Henry Aaron, definitely inequality is not like the growth of grass. Now, let's look at the second question is globalization the common cause of inequality trend reversal? And again, we can make a distinction between what is going on across countries and what is going on within countries. If we look at the evolution between countries, what we have behind the curve that I've shown behind the reversal is essentially the catching up of emerging countries in the recent past. And we can say that partly, at least, this catching up is based on opening up, is based on expanding trade and foreign investments. Now, this is partly the case. I don't think that we can ignore the fact that if we look at the fastest growing country in the world, which is China, the day China decided to reform the economy in 1978, the beginning was not at all globalization. It was completely domestic oriented. It was a household responsibility system. Suddenly, the Chinese economy was becoming more efficient in comparison with the planned economy that was in place before the reforms. So it would be wrong to say that globalization is responsible for the whole thing. But it is true that starting in the mid-80s, the strategy which has been chosen by the Chinese leadership has been a strategy of opening up, a strategy of allowing foreign investments to come in and to re-export labor-intensive goods to the whole world. And if you look again, I mean, it's quite interesting, if you look at the growth rate of China, the reform of the agricultural sector basically has been responsible for a very fast growth rate during 4 or 5 years. So it was the recuperation, the recovering a normal level of productivity in agriculture. And if there had not been the kind of relay given by the opening up and the development of the manufacturing sector and the export orientation of the manufacturing sector, most likely the growth rate would have come down. So we cannot say it is the only reason for this catching up is globalization, but it plays a role. And if we analyze India, we can also say something of the same type. It is true that in the early 90s, there was some reforms making the Indian economy more efficient by deregulating, in particular, some sectors. But at the same time, there was also this opening up, which, as a matter of fact, was copied to some extent on China. What is quite interesting is the fact that lately, this fast development of the emerging countries, of China and in general Asia, has spilled over to other countries in the world. And Latin America has been growing very fast since over the last 10 to 12 years. much faster than they did in the previous 25 years. And in Africa, the change is quite remarkable. During the 80s and the 90s, basically, on average, GDP per capita didn't grow in Africa, or a very, very slow rate. And suddenly they are growing at 4 or 5%. And what is behind that? It is high commodity prices. Not only that, but certainly they play a huge role. And this high commodity prices is linked to the catching up by emerging countries on developed countries. So all this show that the global economy, global trade plays a huge role in explaining or being behind this catching up and this drop in the global inequality. If now we look at what is going on within country, then we have various explanations which have been given to the increase in inequality, and all this really starts some time ago, basically in the 90s, where the US discovered that inequality was increasing very fast. Then there was this big debate, what is the reason behind that? And you had all this literature on, is it the competition with the South, with emerging countries, or is it something else? In particular, is it the kind of technical progress that is being observed, and the bias toward the skilled labor and maybe capital in the technical progress. Behind that, you have a very simple-minded view of the trade theory, which is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, or the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theorem. I mean, it's quite interesting behind that, but I don't have time really to get into that, but the reason why I'm referring to Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson is that this is a theorem which says that at the end, we should equalize the factor reward in the whole world. Some people consider that what is going on these days is precisely that. It may not be so much the case that incomes or earnings will go down very much in developed countries, but because they are growing very fast in emerging countries, maybe this is a convergence which is taking place now. Now, it is certainly the case that at the beginning, back in the 90s, this competition on labor-intensive products played a role. When you look at the evolution of the inequality in the US, it is quite remarkable to see that in the 70s, 80s, it is the bottom of the distribution which is diverging from the rest. From then you have a kind of recovery taking place in the mid-80s and in the 90s, and then it is the top of the distribution which is diverging. Now, some people have tried to understand what was going on, what was behind that. One theory, which I think is quite convincing, is to say that the competition or the reallocation of activity in the world comes into two steps. First, you have the competition on labor-intensive, unskilled labor-intensive goods, and the fact that sectors producing those goods in the US, in Europe, are simply disappearing. They are completely relocated in emerging countries. And then you have a second step, which is that through the new technologies, through the new communication and information technology, you have this relocation or this offshoring of some service activity in the emerging countries. And then the kind of labor which is competing, I mean, the competition is not anymore on the bottom of the distribution, the competition is now more on the middle of the distribution. So the view is really that what we observe is a process by which competition is moving up in terms of skill from the lowest skill, and now there is no more unskilled labor-intensive sectors in developed countries except those sectors which are completely protected from foreign competition, services to the persons in particular. But then the competition moves on to a higher layer of skills, and this is what is being observed. And if this is the case, we understand that this is really the top of the distribution which is gaining at the end. So I think this is a rather interesting view. There is evidence of that, but we also have other explanations. Trade people these days are more and more insisting on the heterogeneity of firms and the fact that exporting firms in all countries have a higher level of productivity, are paying higher earnings, and that the opening up of the global economy and the relocation, the fragmentation of the value chain in various areas is increasing this bias toward the selection of exporting firms, and this may contribute again to inequality. We have to accept, we have to realize that this restructuring of the international value chain is benefiting capital owners and managers. The reason why you have this relocation of activities basically because it is profitable. And globalization is profitable, and because of that, it is the owners of those factors and the managers are those who are benefiting from this. Now, we can also say we have the other view, which is technical progress is another explanation. But I believe that it would be wrong to consider that technical progress is something which is completely independent from globalization. Globalization, before all, is competition, opening competition, enhanced competition in the world. And where I'm coming from in Europe, people tend to consider in some cases that globalization is simply the construction of the single European market. When this was done back in the early 90s, there was a huge competition, a huge restructuration of economic activity in Europe, and at the same time, huge movement of innovation and adoption of new technology. And because of that, we can say that competition, we are back to kind of Schumpeterian views, competition may be responsible for faster technical progress. There is something which is exogenous, certainly, but there is also something which is endogenous, and this is something that we have to take into account. An interesting question now is, this fits well the situation in developed countries. What about developing countries? And if we believe the Stolper-Samuelson story, then we should have the opposite Stolper-Samuelson story in developing countries. And we should observe that unskilled labor has been benefiting from this restructuration of global economic activity, and the other factors have not, again, or in relative terms, have lost. Now, this would be the case if we could assume that the basic assumptions, if the basic principles of the Eggshaw-Lin model applied to those countries. But if we take into account the very simple fact that in developing countries you have this dualism between the modern sector, where wages have something which is exogenous, whether this is efficiency wages or any other reason, and then you have this reserve army of labor in the countryside. All these models by Kuznets, by Lewis, etc., which I think that we can see are working well in countries like China, India, and many others. If this is the case, then opening up will not necessarily benefit labor, or it will benefit labor in a very specific way. It will benefit labor in the sense that the expansion of the modern sector will allow more people to move from the traditional sector, the countryside, to the modern sector and to increase their earnings. This is fine. But earnings, labor earnings, if they are exogenous, will remain exogenous, which means that capital will be gaining in the process. So it is completely consistent to say, for a long time people have said, but there is something wrong in this Stolper-Samuelson model. We should observe that inequality has gone down in developing countries. If you take this very simple fact into account, this is not true. And again, if we look at the evolution, microevolution of the distribution in countries like China, India, etc., looking at firms instead of looking at the whole economy, then this is exactly what we observe. Indeed, wages have gone up, but much less rapidly than the profits. And we have, I was referring to the labor share of GDP. This is a meaningful concept in developed countries, a much less meaningful concept in developing countries because a lot of activity cannot be allocated to labor or to capital. But when you look in China to the evolution of the labor share in the modern sector, the labor share in modern firms, you have this same evolution of a drop in the labor share. So this is completely consistent. So I think it is important to see that there is no symmetry, and the process of globalization may very well generate more inequality on the two sides. The only thing that the story I just told is Kuznets' story, so maybe at some stage we'll have the reversal in that evolution. And when I was going very often to China and discussing with the leadership was asking me either whether at what level of the Gini coefficient would the reversal start, whether it was 0.47 or 0.42. But and as a matter of fact, we don't know. It is possible that this increase in inequality in China is producing irreversible evolution, and you'll have intergenerational transmission of the inequality which has been built, and it is quite possible that there will be no downward part of the inverted U in the Kuznets curve. Let me, take still 5-10 minutes to insist on other reasons why we have this increase in inequality and whether this is maybe linked to globalization or not. I think that when I refer to the increase in competition, we have to take into account that a big thing that has been observed, again, both in developed countries and in developing countries, but more in developed countries, is a deregulation that was aimed at increasing the efficiency of the economies. And again, you can, the justification of that was to say, we need to be more competitive. There are regulations which prevent us to be more competitive. So let's get rid of that, of those rules, and things will be much better. And there are certainly a sector where the regulation has been extremely important, and certainly has played a role in terms of increasing inequality. It is the financial sector, and all the huge rents which appeared in the financial sector when it was deregulated, and the basic story of the too big to fail that we have been discussing quite a lot lately is really an example of the impact of the deregulation and the fact that we have created rents for a class of people which are very, very important. When you look at who are the people in the top 1% of earners in developed countries, you find that there is an overrepresentation of people in the financial sector. I mean, we know, and not only in the financial sector, people in financial occupations in other sectors of the economy, in the manufacturing sector. I mean, the CFO in any company is somebody who is making a lot of money. And if the CFO is making a lot of money, the CEO must make at least the same amount of money. So you have this kind of contagion, which has been very, very important to explain what has been this kind of surge in the share of the top income, which I showed before, may be explained in those terms. Another very big reason why inequality has increased in many countries, this is more the case in developed countries, it is the fact that the progressivity of the redistribution system, or the tax system, has gone down enormously. In the book, I'm giving this reference that if you look at the UK, between the end of the 70s and today, the top marginal tax rate in the UK went down from 83% to 40%. this necessarily has a huge impact on the distribution. And you had the same kind of tax reform in the US. In Sweden, after the banking crisis of the early 90s, you had this big reform taking place in Sweden, and one of the important parts of the reform is to reduce tax rate at the very top. And this is something which is now more or less general, simply because, again, there is contagion, simply because globalization means more mobility of capital, of course, of people too. This means that there is a lot of constraints for one single country to impose a very progressive tax system. So again, we cannot, I'm not saying that the reason why we decided to have less progressive tax system is only due to globalization, but globalization plays a role. And globalization today is putting a lot of constraint on any government who would like to increase taxes. In my country, you may know that there was a big reform which was undertaken by the new government, which was to increase, to have a 75% tax rate on people earning more than 1 million euros a year. There is a lot of noise around that measure, simply because people said, okay, if you do that, then we are moving out. We are going to work in Belgium. This is next door, and some people did it. So this is the kind of constraint that globalization is introducing. So I think that we should really factor that in all the explanation. And financialization is, again, something important in explaining the increase in the share of profit in the GDP, the fact that shareholders or pension funds are more or less everywhere in the world and are trying to get as much as possible from economic activity is also part of the inequality. So I think I'm more or less at the end of my time. So maybe this is the most important part, which is what should we do? My point is, okay, I try to summarize that very, very quickly, and I stop. I think that we have to look at things at two levels. At the global level, we could say things are going on very well, so let's continue. And I think that we can be confident that the catching up of developed countries by emerging countries will continue, even though maybe at a lower rate. It may be the case that the growth rate is going down in China, it's going down in India. But what is important is that it's still much, much higher than the growth rate in developed countries, which, as a matter of fact, will remain low for quite some time. And I would say that the only concern would be with the poorest countries, in particular countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which today are doing well because of high commodity prices. Maybe commodity prices will remain high. Maybe, probably, they will not grow much, much above where they are today in relative terms, in real terms. But the problem is to know whether those countries are able to rely essentially on those commodities, given the huge demographic growth in those countries. In the next 30 or 40 years, you'll have 1 billion more people in the sub-Saharan continent. It's very difficult to imagine that those people could live on those commodity prices, on those commodity, the rents of those commodities, whether they are oil, whether this is oil, or whether copper, mineral commodities, or even coffee, cocoa, cotton, etc. Simply because you need something else, and you need some diversification, and there is an issue. And as a development economist, I believe that we should certainly not give up to aid and to development assistance. This is something which remains very, very important. When we look at within country, then I would say that probably inequality, forces toward more inequality will continue to be present. And what can we do to counteract those forces? Certainly the redistribution system could be reinforced, but this requires some kind of coordination And these days, it is we don't see very well how the coordination across countries taking place to increase the progressivity of the system, although this attack on tax havens by the United States, this proposal by the Obama administration to increase taxes, if it were not for the present scandal with the Internal Revenue Service and the rather dirty job done by those people in spying on the opposition, if it were not that, there is some forces going in that direction. So I don't say that we should be completely pessimistic, but certainly it is not something that can be decided from a day to the next. I think that there is a very strong case to re-regulate sectors which have been deregulated and which have contributed to both inefficiency and inequality. And this is certainly the case for the financial sector. And this may be the case for other type of regulation. And finally, I think that, and this is something which is true for developed countries as well as for developing countries, this is not linked to globalization. This is something which is somewhat orthogonal, but we have to realize that what we learned from analyzing inequality and the relationship between inequality and growth, inequality and efficiency over the last 15 years or 20 years is that what matters is not so much the inequality of outcomes, it is inequality of opportunities, inequality of capabilities, whatever, I mean, assets that people have to work on and to make a living. And from that point of view, there are still huge possibilities of improving things. It is true in terms of human capital accumulation. It is true in terms of making sure that there is no discrimination taking place in several markets, in particular the labor market. It is the case with trying to make sure that the intergenerational transmission of inequality is not too strong. And from that point of view, there is possibilities. And if we want to be serious on trying to fight inequality, then this could be used. Let me finish simply saying that we can look at this fight against inequality as essentially an ethic objective, and saying, okay, this is good because this goes in the direction of social justice. I think that this is certainly something that many people view, that many people would share. But what is important also is the political economy that is behind that. And the fact that the reason why inequality at some stage is something bad, it is basically because it is reducing the efficiency of the economy. Some people these days are trying to analyze the origin, partly the origin of the crisis in the US in terms of the increase in inequality that took place before. I don't have time to get into that, but there are quite convincing stories that you can tell. This is certainly not the only explanation, but this may be part of the explanation. And if this is the case, then I think that the reason why we must contain the increase in inequality, it is because of that. But I'm sorry that I could not cover that. I stop here. I already have been too long. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. That was a real masterpiece. You covered an incredible amount of material, and we're getting close to our allotted time limit, but I think, do you have a little time for Q&A?
You've been,
thank you very much.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
No
Okay, so the floor is now open. Let's move with questions. We have a microphone as well at the back. Please identify yourself so Professor Bourguignon sort of knows who you are. So, yes, Raghav Jha. He runs our India Centre.
Okay.
Thank you very much for an excellent and wide-ranging survey of the field. My name is Francois Bourguignon. I'm a colleague of Halil's. I have got a couple of comments. The first thing is that you have included Gini coefficients on income when you're comparing developed and developing countries with Gini coefficients on consumption. For example, in India, there is no income data. So if you are including consumption Ginis, why not include wealth Ginis, which would probably have increased for the entire world? That would be different from the experience with income Ginis. So I think the common denominator should be clarified. That's one point that I wanted to make. The second point that I wanted to make is that globalization we have talked about in very general terms, but I would like to submit that one of the reasons why inequality has behaved the way it has, particularly with respect to assets, is that globalization of finance has gone faster than globalization of trade. Even in very closed economies, relatively closed economies, financial markets are either open de facto or de jure for outside transfers and outside activities. So that's one point that I would like to make. And the final point is that concerning within country inequality, and you mentioned the difficulty of raising income taxes because people would simply leave. You had a very famous case in one of your citizens went over to Russia.
Monsieur
But the other side of the coin is that in many of these countries, in Europe and even in developing countries, more and more taxes are being raised by a very regressive tax, which is the commodity tax, value-added tax, or GST, which is paid as a flat rate by everybody, and therefore by definition is regressive. So whereas it is difficult to change the progressive tax structure on income, you are also relying on a very regressive tax structure, increasingly relying on a regressive tax structure, which is going to worsen the distribution of income. And to finally end my comment, remind you that of the result of Emran and Stiglitz in the Journal of Public Economics 2005, where they said that the imposition of value-added taxes in developing countries is going to lead to a much larger scale of tax evasion, because output in many of these countries comes from the informal sector, which is not recorded, and services will remain untaxed. So I'll stop there.
May I answer that? Okay.
Please, thank you.
Thank you very much for this remarks. On the first one, okay, the difference between consumption and income is, in terms of inequalities, is well known. This will not change the evolution. The trend would not be sensitive to that. Now, technically, some people say we know that the Gini of consumption is 2 points, 3 points below the one of the income. So let's make the correction, and this is not really changing the evolution. Now, when you say that the inequality of wealth would matter, I'm not completely clear about this. I mean, the inequality I've been referring to is inequality in the standards of living. Inequality of wealth is a different type. It is an inequality in assets, which possibly will lead to an inequality of income, but income is not only determined by the extent of wealth. Human capital is something very important, and rents obtained from some kind of market power is something important. So we cannot say that there is a direct mapping from the wealth distribution into income distribution. And when you say that the wealth distribution in the world has become more unequal, I'm not completely convinced by that. When we look at the increase in the wealth in emerging countries, it is considerable. The financialization of the economies have played a role in developing countries as well as in developed countries. It is true that because of the fluctuation of the stock market, there is some big changes taking place in the inequality of wealth. But I mean, this is a topic per se, but in terms of analyzing the way in which the global economy goes, I'm not convinced that wealth would be more relevant or as relevant as the standards of living. By the way, I mentioned that there are people working on the global distribution of wealth. There is work by Tony Shorrocks and Jim Davis when Shorrocks was the head of Wilder. As far as I know, they are continuing analyzing that, but I've not seen their latest production, so I don't know exactly whether they found the same drop that we're finding in the income distribution. On the role of finance, globalization of finance, yes, I mean, I agree 100% with you. And this is the reason why I insisted on the financial aspect in my presentation, maybe not enough. I also mentioned the financiarization of all the economies in the world, which is playing a big role in increasing inequality. So you are 100% right, and this is certainly an important factor which is responsible for the increase in inequality within countries. So I don't think that there is any kind of disagreement on that. But having said that, it is not the financiarization which explains why unskilled labor workers have lost in the distribution in many countries. So we cannot say that it is the only force is finance. There are other forces, and it is important to take them into account. About the tax system, the VAT, I mean, this view that the VAT tax is regressive, I'm not sure that it is something which is completely satisfactory. If we are in developed countries where more or less nobody or very few people or very few activities escape the value-added tax. Value-added tax is a tax on consumption, and the regressivity is coming from the fact that poor people are saving less than rich people. So in terms of their income, the VAT is more important for poor people than for rich people. And this is where this idea of the regressivity is coming from. But if you say that all the savings will be consumed at some point of time, then you have to look at the VAT not with respect to income, but with respect to consumption expenditures. The only difference between the two concepts is to know what is happening when some people dies and the wealth is being transmitted to the descendants. Then the descendants will consume somewhere the tax on bequest, the way in which bequests are being taxed plays a role. But if it were not for that, it is not completely clear that there is a lot of regressivity in the VAT. Now, when you look at developing countries, you think things are different. Things are different for another reason, which is not the fact that you have people who do not pay and people who pay the VAT. It is not so much the fact that you have evasion. Evasion is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. The big problem is the fact that the VAT means that when you buy a good, you should be reimbursed of the tax that is on the good. And if you are in the informal sector, you are not reimbursed. Okay? So the problem is that the informal sector has a disadvantage with respect to the formal sector because they buy goods at a price which includes taxes, when in the formal sector the goods are bought, I mean inputs are bought at a price which exclude taxes. So from that point of view there is, we agree with that, a distortion linked to VAT. And from that point of view there should be an evolution in the way in which taxes are being levied in developing countries. And this is a point that I could not make here, but it seems to me that there is a very strong case in emerging countries for putting together an income tax system which is really effective. Why? Simply because for a long time the reason why there was no such an income tax system, an effective income tax system, was because it was difficult to monitor the income of the people. But today, with the development of the financial instruments that everybody use, credit card, banking accounts, etc., it is much easier to monitor individual incomes. And it is, I think there is a very strong case in emerging countries, middle-income countries, to say now it is time to build an income tax system which is effective. And I think this is something that should be very high in the policy agenda in those countries.
Thank you very much. My name is Li Gangsong from Crawford School, and very informative, very insightful. So I'd like to raise two questions. Number one, that when we first look at the charts and about global inequality, and I immediately thought, I thought, wow, goodness, it won't work. And then you give another chart which shows that
exactly this works.
Yeah. I said, wow, goodness, it works in the long run. But however, actually challenges the falling trend of the Gini in a global sense. Because the data you presented later on, you can see all the rising inequality in the most popular nations in the world, China and other countries. But also in the rich country, there's a U-curve of a high income share in the countries, United States and others. How come you can expect, the Gini flowing after 2000? So that's my first question. My second question, I think, is probably as an important item is a meeting from your policy discussions. And you refer to Stoffel-Summerson theory, and it's very important. However, for Stoffel-Summerson to work, we need a free trade. No competition in terms of trade. So therefore, the most abundant supply of factory production, which the labor in poor countries can benefit more from that line. But precisely because the global trading system is not working well, a lot of barriers to trade, so freer trade or fairer trade, which is actually so crucial for later comers. So I'm just wondering whether in the policy, I agree with the financialization, taxation reform, all fine. But how about the trade? Thanks.
Okay, on the first point, you have to realize that the evolution of the global distribution results from two different forces. On the one hand, you have the evolution of the distribution within country, and on the other hand, you have the evolution of the distribution between countries. And the reason why you have this kind of paradoxical or almost contrarian evolution is simply because what has been dominating over the last 25 years is the drop in the inequality between countries. Okay? Now, it is, you could very well, with some inequality decomposition analysis, you might very well identify exactly how much in the change in the global inequality is due to increase in inequality within countries and how much is due to the reduction in inequality across countries. But what we are, the process we are in today is a process where the between-country inequality is dominating what is going on within countries. Now, it may be the case that later on things will be completely modified. At some stage, this is quite something interesting. When you look at the case of China, the day, more or less the day China will be at a level of income which will be the global average, then suddenly what is going on in China will change completely. And further growth in China will, faster growth than in developed countries, this time will increase inequality rather than reduce inequality. So this may change in the future. I'm not saying that we have a Kuznets curve and now we are in the downward part of the Kuznets curve and everything is fine. Let's surf on that wave. This is not the point. The point is that today it is decreasing. And we may expect that this will be the case for still some time. Okay? So there is no contradiction from that point of view. Your point about trade, in order for the theorem to apply, we need two things. One, we don't need necessarily free trade. Stoffel-Summerson is we open up. Okay? And from that point of view, this is more or less what we have observed in the world over the last 30 years. We had an opening up of trade, even though trade is far from completely free. And we know that there are countries which find it difficult to get in, or it may also go in the opposite direction, maybe because trade is too free to some extent. Some countries are not able to protect themselves to start developing some manufacturing sector which will be the basis for their further development. I really have in mind sub-Saharan African countries from that point of view. But for the theorem to work, we also need we need more to some extent the assumptions about the way in which markets behave within countries. And the point I was making before is the fact that markets are not behaving necessarily in the way in which it is assumed in the theorem. So again, I don't see that there is contradiction from that point of view.
We have time for one last question.
Thanks for that. Grant Walton from the Development Policy Centre. Thanks for a great presentation. I've got a question on one comment that you made. It was a little bit in passing. You said that in China wages have increased, but not at the same rate that profit has. In the US, wages have increased far more than productivity. It's not such a case in Australia. But it seems that from your presentation, there are a number of implications that might be apparent for labour rights, for things like setting minimum wages, encouraging trade unions, those types of things. I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you for raising this point. 40 minutes, I think it's from 45, was not enough definitely to go over all these issues. But this is a very good point. I mean, I mentioned the deregulation of the labour market as, again, a possible explanation for an increase in inequality. And from that point of view, the minimum wage you just alluded to is something very, very important. I mean, I happen to be a citizen of a country where the minimum wage is something important, it is very much binding. And it is also a country where inequality has changed very, very little over the recent past. And when you try to understand why it is the case, then you discover that the minimum wage has played a huge role. And in the case of France, for different reasons, the minimum wage has increased over the last 20 years. And somehow this was linked to the reform which brought down the number of hours of work a week from 40 to 35. At the same time, they had to change the minimum wage because the minimum wage, which was defined on a monthly basis, was not anymore consistent with the hourly minimum wage. Because of that, there was several adjustments. All the adjustments, of course, were made upward because politically it would be difficult to make adjustments of this type downward. And because of that, the minimum wage has increased. And this is one of the reasons why inequality has barely changed in France. And what is interesting is that when you look at the detail, you find that people who have suffered in the whole process are people at the middle of the distribution, who were caught between the bottom, which was protected by the minimum wage, and the top, which was moving up for other reasons. So this means that labour market institutions like minimum wage, like the power of union, which is also something which is rather well documented in the literature, is playing a role to explain the evolution of inequality. The role of the union is not completely clear. I mean, the premise to try to understand why it is okay that in many countries the way in which wages are being bargained has changed quite a lot over the last decades. One reason which has been put forward by several people is to say that collective bargaining was extremely important in times of high inflation because it was necessary to resist the natural tendency toward lowering of real wages. And now that we are in a world where there is very little inflation, then things are different and there is much less need for this kind of collective bargaining. And because you don't have anymore this collective process, then some people in the distribution are much less well protected than they were before. So you're absolutely right to say that labor market institutions play a huge role in that. But from this, we can move to another issue, which I don't think that we have very much time to get into that, which is the fact that in the debate about differences between emerging countries and developed countries, there is this issue of the labor standards and the fact that many emerging countries do not observe the labor standards, and you have this kind of critique made to those countries, saying, okay, this is the reason why they can be more competitive than other countries in the world, and there is something which is inherently wrong or unfair in all this. This is, I think, an important political debate. I didn't want to get into that, but my only point is that it is true that labor institutions play a big role.
Thank you. I have a feeling we could continue this conversation for several more hours, but Professor Bourguignon's time is very limited. Thank you so much for an insightful presentation. You've whetted our appetite for the book. I think you will get some sales here for sure, Professor Bourguignon. And we do hope you'll come back and visit us again for another presentation. So can you join me in thanking our speakers?